This is the code for Noteherder. We import font awesome, CSS, Bootstrap, CSS. Anybody used Bootstrap before? Okay. It's a lot like Foundation. They're two solutions to the same problem. A front-end framework that gives you lots of CSS classes you can throw on things, a nice grid system, all that stuff. And this is mostly custom CSS in this app, but we do use Bootstrap just a tad. Okay. We import some CSS, no surprise. This is a Firebase thing, which probably isn't a shock to you. Now this was built on the previous version of the Rebase package. You may recall that there was a new version released just a few days ago. So this is the previous version, but that's okay, because we specify which version we depend on. Where do we do that? What file is that in? Where we say that we need Rebase? Say again? Yeah, package.json, right? Rebase 2.7.0 instead of 3.0. Now, we didn't type that in there. How did it get in there? Did we wish it in? Yarn add or npm install -- save. That's how we add these dependencies to package.json. So since we specify the version number, the fact that they've since upgraded hasn't broken it. All right, we import a sign-in component and we import a main component. And then we import public route and private route, which I said are not things that are built into React Router. They're things that we wrote here. And we'll look at those in a minute. Okay, now instead of using a property initializer, we actually set up state in our constructor, which is the far more common way to do it. So don't forget we have to call super to run components constructor. And then we set up our initial state with a null UID and an empty array for nodes. Component will mount. So what do we call these things? The lifecycle methods. Did we pick the name component will mount? Now, we wrote this method, but that name is significant. That's something that's defined in the superclass in component. So if that method is present, it will run it at the appropriate time in the component's lifecycle. I did that this morning too. Lifestyle? Components don't have a lifestyle. Lifecycle. So component will mount runs right before it's been rendered to the DOM, right? First thing we do, this.getUser from local storage. Ooh, we used local storage a long time ago. So we're combining local storage with Firebase in this one. Now there are actually some side effects to that this app doesn't deal with, but that's okay. So if you think for a moment, oh crap, now we have to combine these two totally different ideas. Remember, React is responsible for a relatively small amount of what we're actually doing. It's just JavaScript. You use local storage here the way you would anywhere else. If we look at that getUser from local storage method, it's right down here. All we do is do local storage.getItem just like we would in any JavaScript app. And we save it to a constant and we set state. Okay, so we do that. Then we run this on-auth thing, which is something that's in this version of Rebase that isn't in the one that we used. But we did something similar. That basically, before we ever render the page, if there's a user, then we run the auth handler. Otherwise, we run sign out. So that's why when we weren't logged in, if we went to some other deep URL, it just redirected us right to the sign out page. All right, so after getUser from local storage, we have auth handler, very similar to the one in thing list. We set the UID on state. One difference here, we also set it in local storage. That way, we can get it from local storage before we've heard back from the API. Now, what's the value in doing that? We have another function that checks whether we're logged in. And it'll see that we're logged in as soon as we load the user ID from local storage. We don't have to wait to hear back from Firebase. We don't have to wait for the whole authentication process to work. Now it's called auth instead of logged in here, or signed in, but same thing. Let's do a little trick here. Return not this.state.uid. I'll talk about that again in a second. Sign out. Again, this is a rebase method that isn't there in the version we used, but we had a very simple method to log out from Firebase. Then we just set the UID back to null on state, and we remove UID from local storage. All things we know how to do individually. Setup notes is very much like one of the methods that we wrote in thing list. So let's look at this first line. If not this.state.uid, return. In English, what is this doing? Yeah. 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 If you're not signed in, it gets the heck out of there. Now we already have this.auth, right? So instead of checking for UID specifically, we could have said, if not this.auth. Might be a little simpler. For one thing, it makes it a little clearer that that's what you really care about. It's not so much that you're that interested in the UID, it's that you want to know whether this person's signed in or not, right? So we just return, and then we're out of this method. Otherwise, we call sync state, which we did before. Very much like we did in thing list. Let's look at save note. First, we get date.now and set it to a timestamp. Then we have a local variable, should redirect, and we set it to false. See if we can figure out why we're doing that. Then it says, if not node ID. Now, what is it really asking? If not node ID, in other words, if what? So this is save note. This is how it saves a note. If not node ID, yeah, Clayton.
If the note doesn't have an ID, which means it's a new note.
Exactly. If it's a new note, right? So if we wanted to make it a little clearer what this line is, we could write a method for that. We could write one called new note. We could write one that called existing note. If we did existing note, or note exists, whatever. And that could just be return note.id, because if it's either going to be a string that is the ID, or it's going to be undefined or something, right? Or null. And null and undefined are falsy, so that's fine. But what if we wanted to force this to return a Boolean? How could we force that to be a Boolean? We really wanted the values true and false. Anybody have any ideas? I'll show you the trick I like to use. Double negative. Take something truthy like a string that isn't an empty string. Put not in front of it and it becomes false, right? Put not in front of that and it becomes true. If, on the other hand, you have an empty string, which is falsy, you stick not in front of it, it's true. Stick not in front of that, and it becomes false again. So you'll have the same truthiness, falsiness value, but as an actual Boolean, just by throwing a double negative in front of something. So if you want to be absolutely sure you get a Boolean, a double negative is a way to achieve that. So then we could say, if not node ID, if not this dot node exists. And it's just a little clearer to the reader why that check is there. because we're looking for whether this thing exists yet or not. So if it doesn't exist, we're going to set the ID to note dash this timestamp. And we're going to set this variable should redirect to true. It's false presently. So you get what's happening here? If we're editing an existing note, if we're updating an existing note, here's my URL. I change it. URL doesn't change, right? We don't need to redirect to update an existing note. But if we're creating a brand new note, as soon as we save it, we want to make sure we're no longer on the new notes page, right? We're on the page for this specific note. So as soon as we start putting something in here, we redirect to the correct ID. So if it doesn't already have an ID, we give it an ID, and we set should redirect to true. Then we add a field called updated that gets the time that it was updated, which is date.now. Then we get the notes out of state, and we set the specific note that we updated, much like we did before in thing list. We set state, and then here's the extra piece. If should redirect, then this.props.history.push, which you used yesterday, right? And we push on the route for that specific note. Make sense? A couple things we haven't done before, but mostly stuff we could figure out. Remove note. Get these things out of state. Set it back to null so that when it's synced with Firebase, it'll remove it. We update state. And then, again, when we delete, we don't want to stay on the page for an ID that no longer exists, right? We want to get back to the blank one. So we push on to history again. Pretty clear, pretty understandable. Might take us a while to write it, but not too bad. And mostly stuff we've done before with a few new tricks that are well within our capabilities. Now things are going to get just a tad weird when we get down into render.